Thank you. This is Port Gregory, 40 or so miles north. Beautiful little place. I recommend straight after the lecture, if you haven't been there, go up and have a look. It's one of the great secrets, I think, of the Midwest. Our little ship lies just opposite Hillock Point there, which you can see. It's the SS Xantho, and at the time of its loss in 1872, it was moving lead ore from the Geraldine mine, which is near Northampton. It's become one of Australia's most important shipwrecks for reasons that you'll see soon. Though at the time we were concentrating solely on the Dutch East India ships and wooden ships, and iron ships were not considered very important. You see here its register. Registry is closed in 1874. Vessel sunk at Port Gregory, Western Australia on November 1872. It's an iron steamship built in 1848, though it sinks in 1872, and it's powered by one horizontal British-built engine built in 1861 by the famous John Penn and Son of London. So it was built as a paddle steamer to work inland waters in Scotland. It was built at a time when the Great Britain was also built, and at the time people were wondering whether iron ships could even float, which was a big argument at the time. And it was also clinker built, which would be interesting to those machinists amongst you, not with flat plates as you see today, but clinker built with rivets. And it was converted, would you believe, by a scrap metal merchant who bought not only the ship but a 10-year-old Royal Navy engine. And he presented it like this, quite a pretty ship. And you notice in those days they were also sailing ships. And here is the builder of that engine, John Penn, the famous John Penn of England. And there is his workshop at the time he was building the engine for HMS Warrior, which sits alongside HMS Victory and Mary Rose in England today. When I looked at the wreck in 1983, it was as expected. We treated it as a new class of archaeological site because at the time everyone was dealing with wooden ships. And there is the wreck. Most of the hull is gone. The boiler's there, of course, you can see. But what's of great interest to us at the time was this engine, which I realised was actually not just a horizontal engine as advertised in the register, but a trunk engine. These two thingies sticking out the bottom down here are trunks that are very much a unique thing. Now, Catherine's got a Subaru, and a Subaru and a Volkswagen have horizontally opposed engines, don't they? And they go this way, like that. Well, this is a single one here at the side, and the connecting rod connects to the centre of the piston there. But at the time, they didn't realise they could have closed it off. And to balance it and have it double acting, they had a great big pipe down the centre. So you're losing the centre of your piston. Now, this is not an efficient engine, and it can only be utilised in Navy ships. And the reasons for them because if you had your engine the normal way, which is an upright engine before they invented the Volkswagen and the Subaru engine, and you took a fight and you had a broadside, it would go straight through your ship and clean up your engine, and your asset, as the Americans would call them, would be destroyed. In this case, if you have a horizontal engine, only a few sailors would be killed and your engine would be okay. Totally inefficient. My off-sider, Jeff Kimpton, spent an entire 2 weeks in 1983 drawing the engine, and we sent his beautiful artwork. You know, when you look at this, is an extraordinary rendition of that engine, back to the Warrior people, and they said, "Oh my God, you've got the only known Crimean War gunboat type engine left in the world. You've got it there. It's the first high-pressure, high-revolution, mass-produced engine ever made for use at sea, and you've got it there." Insanely jealous they were. But the question is, what is a gunboat engine? Extremely inefficient. Be the equivalent of me taking, say, one of those stealth bombers and flying back to Fremantle today in it. Huge amounts of money to even operate the thing. What is this doing on a coast that's got no fresh water supplies, easily available, no coal, and no engineering. The nearest engineering depot is in Melbourne and Surabaya. What is it doing here? An experimental engine. And we have to ask this question as to what's going on. Now, I'm not going to give you death by PowerPoint and read it to you. You've been to those lectures, haven't you? You almost die reading it. I know all of you went to school and can read. Who would do this? This man here, Charles Edward Broadhurst, an extraordinary person. He is the forerunner to Laurie Connell, Alan Bond, Claude de Benalis, the famous entrepreneur from the goldfields. He's as controversial as them. Some of you ladies will remember Grandma wandering around in bulletproofs, which are those stockings you had to wear if you went to college or school. They were called bulletproofs because they were so strongly knitted. They were by the Tootle Broadhurst Lee and Company of Manchester. And he was the third son of a fabulously rich family. And in the post-Napoleonic period, if you couldn't buy a commission in the army or the navy, and you couldn't buy a curatorship, so you were sent out to the colonies to join your brothers and sisters and stuff out in the colonies. And he came here and settled at Melbourne on an enormous block of land as squatters with his brother. And when you look at this idyllic scene of sort of almost Britain taken out to Victoria, and as you know, Victoria is a little bit like Britain in style, climatically, you wonder why would anybody come here? You'd also wonder why this beautiful woman who married him would come here too. She's a singer, a musician. She's born in Ireland, as it says. Her father had married 3 times, twice before his wife died in childbirth. And so Eliza here, totally different to her husband, has been brought up as the daughter of a school teacher, as the elder sister bringing up loads of other kids. She's hard-headed, she's practical. And when they marry, they buy land in their own right and they enter the Indian horse trade. India took lots of horses, even from here, interestingly, very big horse trade out of here. And you see there they bought an Arab stallion, Cochlani, for £500. Now, some clown will tell you that that's $1,000. And you get this all the time, and it drives me wild. And your dad or granddad, you say, oh, when I was a boy, I'd get a beer for 6p. You know, prices are high nowadays. And, well, the old drunk, I mean, 6p was an awful lot of money. A mid-level government servant earned £100 a year. And if you were a cleaning lady, you got £30 a year. Now, you go taking 6p out of £30 a year to go and have a beer every week or Friday, that's a lot of money. So it doesn't equate. So that £500 is a huge amount of money. If you say a mid-level government servant today earns $100,000, just to round it off, that'd be nice if they did, that is $500,000 for that horse. So they obviously were pretty well off. So why come here? This is Western Australia, the Swan River colony, in 1865, and it was a disaster from the start. The population was only, in 1865, when they're starting to come across, 21,000 people. That's the entire Western Australia. There wasn't a single European living north of the Murchison River at the time. And the place was in terrible stagnation. Not only that, transport was so bad, you were allowed 10 days to travel from Fremantle to Champion Bay in summer and 14 days in winter. That was what you had to allow, not get on the car and 5 hours up. It was 10 days you could be in transit on what they used to call cockroach-ridden old tubs. And even Fremantle was rudimentary in the centre there. And the only steamers that operated were on the river, and they couldn't get out of the river because there was a bar across the river. They had to build them on the river and leave them in the river. We didn't have steam until 50 years after little old Timor had it. We were so far behind. But the answer lies in squatting. The Broadhursts were on 57 square kilometres. The miners were coming off the mines after the Victorian gold rush. They realised the way to power was to get into Parliament, and they were agitating for land, and the squatters knew their days were numbered. So they started to look to the north of Australia, where the explorers are busy coming back saying, wow, this is wonderful. Classic stuff. The explorers had been up there straight after a long period of rains. And they were saying, look, this is just wonderful. It's a pastoralist El Dorado. You must go there. And so naturally they're looking at these pamphlets and these reports and so on and saying, gee, I wonder if we can get land up there. And Western Australia decided in 1862 that if you landed in the North District with 20 cattle, 20 horses, or 200 sheep, you were given 100,000 acres rent-free for 8 years. Now, for a squatter down in Melbourne who's going to lose their land, this was irresistible. And people began to pour across to Western Australia, the Swan River colony, and start heading north in the 1860s, in 1862, when this happened. And then in comes the scammers. And a man called William Harvey in Melbourne reads all this, and he puts together companies. Okay, you give me £150, remembering £100 was a mid-level government servant's wage. I will transport you and your stock to the North District, and you'll get your 100,000 acres. Now, that's not a bad result, really. And his first place he was going to land is at Camden Harbour, right at the very top there of Western Australia, near the Fitzroy River. And that was where they were going to settle. A wonderful harbour, as good as King George Sound. And Harvey had plans of opening a new gateway to Australia through Camden Harbour there to avoid having to get to Sydney and Melbourne via some of the most difficult seaways in the world. Bass Strait, killed thousands. The Torres Strait, hopeless to get through. So if you could come into Australia through Camden Harbour and then access all of this country over here, you are going to open a new gateway. And his plan was to open a whole load of telegraph stations and pastoral stations joining Camden Harbour to Stewart's new route from Adelaide to present-day Darwin. Stewart had just opened it. This was Harvey's dream. There are the various things that, we won't try and read all that. Of course, it's basically saying, you can go up and do this. And there is the formation of the Denison Plains Company. Now, where is the Denison Plains? It's at Halls Creek. Now, any of you who know Halls Creek and have seen it in bad conditions, it's appalling. But would you believe when the explorers went there, there was grass higher than the saddlebags, there was freshwater lakes 10 feet deep in these regions. They called it the Denison Plains, and this was going to be the next big centre after Camden Harbour. Charles Broadhurst decides to apply and join this one. They originally joined the Camden Harbour group. He's going to lead the first settlements there. And Eliza, she's 6 months pregnant with 2 boys aged 1 and 2. She says, righto, I'll come, but I've got to bring my piano. If I don't bring my piano, I'm not coming. There he is heading the group. And there is the Denison Plains. You can see I've just put it in there. And there's Stewart's route going from Adelaide north. Not a bad idea, except that no one had been in there, but the explorers in good conditions. And you imagine Eliza bringing a piano and pregnant and 2 kids, walking from Camden Harbour, thank you very much, across to the Denison Plains. It's not going to happen. What's also amazing about the Denison Plains Company is the number of women that are involved. Normally the people coming from Melbourne were essentially men. There'd be a few women. Mrs. Withnell, Emma Withnell, was one of the few women who got to the North District in this early period. Suddenly a whole crowd of women are coming. Some of them had children. One child was only 1 year old, apart from Eliza Broadhurst's, and she was 6 months pregnant. And there was this whole crowd of women and men who were going to lead the Denison Plains Company into Western Australia. Their plan is to land at Camden Harbour, but by the time they got to Fremantle, it had already collapsed. People were dying from heat stroke, sheep were dying. You know what it's like up there. It's impossible for anything but cattle. Even then, it's pretty bad. So they decided to go down to Roebuck Bay, where a group of men had started the Roebuck Bay Pastoral Company. However, they couldn't get into Roebuck Bay. The wind stopped them getting in. They had to go all the way up to Bali and then down again to try and beat into the bay, but couldn't. So they went down to Nickel Bay, where the Withnells were, and lots of other people. And the Europeans had been welcomed in only 2 places in the whole of Western Australia by the Aborigines: Nickel Bay and Albany. Why at Nickel Bay? Apparently because the Burrup Peninsula is the traditional welcoming point for anything that comes from the sea. And that's why all those wonderful engravings are there. They land, they move out to Mayari Pool, which is on the Maitland River, and there Eliza gives birth to the first European girl born in the north. They settle there, they're there for a while, and then they decide to move in to Withnell Station on the Harding River, where all the others were tending to centralise themselves. As this little settlement grew, they declared the town of Roban. Eliza becomes the first woman to own land in the North District. She buys 5 blocks of land in Roban. There is, setting it in the context for you, the Burrup Peninsula, Roban, Cossack, which you know today, Mayari Pool down left down there, and various other stations, including Inthanuna, which I'll bring you back to later, in this earlier period. Now, can you imagine Eliza landing with a piano at Cossack? Have you been there? It's like, when you get off the plane, it's like sticking your head in an oven, a 200-degree oven, when you put the roast on for Sunday or whatever. It's just stunning. Emma Withnell records that when the Denison Plains women landed, they were in finery that she had only seen in the catalogues. Stunned. I mean, she loved to see the women come, but she couldn't believe it. And what was amazing is that Eliza, with her piano and her music and her singing, became a social centre for the entire male population. They were always dropping into Broadhurst tent and their little hut. That is her music book that the family donated to the museum some time ago. Mendelssohn, Song Without Words. However, Charles Broadhurst starts to become reviled as the leader of the Denison Plains Company. Though it was this man, Harvey, he was the leader of the company in the north, and when it started to go wrong, when the drought set in, he was blamed for it. He became hated, as happens. She became loved by everybody, of course, and she became one of the most important women in the North District. While they were there, the Aborigines were coming in wearing pearl shell, and they'd been looking for shell for thousands and thousands of years. There's the Wandjina from 5,000 years, the Guion or Bradshaw people from 30,000 years, and they would have been harvesting pearl shell. Their trade in pearl shell is extraordinary. They'd been finding Norwest pearl shell this far in. You've probably read songlines, and there's some wonderful stories in there of these movements of goods by the Aboriginal people, especially pearl shell. But it was quite a complicated and important trade, because pearl shell was very highly valued by the Aboriginal people. I won't read Mumbuddy's statement there, but it's just beautiful. Pearl shell is so important. It has a lot of religious significance to them. And there you see the complexity of the trade process in movements of ochres, in movements of all sorts of things, knives, baler shells and so on, using pearl shell also. This is the trade routes that you see. And for years, right up until the 70s, we did not understand the complexity of Aboriginal culture. Its social mores, the trade, the complexities of intermarriage rules and all that. At the time, we essentially dismissed them as lesser beings, but it's only in the last 30 years that we've come to realise how complicated it has been. Europeans prize shell, of course. There's the famous Queen Elizabeth, and pearls. And our great pirate and hydrographer was the first to see pearl shell on this coast, other than the Aborigines. He, as you know, landed at Sharks Bay, which he named, and there became Australia's first natural historian by describing the flora and fauna and having it drawn by his clerk, Charles Brand. And he becomes our first natural historian 70 years ahead of Banks. And interestingly, he publishes over 100 years ahead of Banks. Here's his description, for example, of the shells that he saw. Extraordinary man. There's a book in the bookshop here, A Pirate of Exquisite Mind, and he was all of that. I recommend that to you over the boring Captain Cook books, which everybody tells you he found Australia, which he didn't, of course. The Dutch did and Dampier did. Have a look at A Pirate of Exquisite Mind. We also find that the Macassans were coming down from Unjung Pandang, and they were mixing with the Aborigines, taking them back, sometimes forcibly, often voluntarily, back to Macassar, and they were harvesting shell and harvesting bêche de mer and so on, or sea slugs. And we also know the American whalers were coming here and picking up shell because we found some on one of their wrecks from 1841. Huge numbers of whalers on this coast in the 1840s, 200 French, British and American noted in 1 year. So when the Europeans, Gregory landed in 1861 at Nickel Bay and went off inland, his crew went pearling and recovered 500 to 600 pounds of shell and a pearl while he was off in the Nickel Bay region. So the explorers, the settlers who followed him knew that there was shell there to be had. And in fact, they started straight away to find shell, but not much of it. And they collected it using the Aborigines. They watched the Aborigines, and the Aborigines helped them at low water spring tides. Why would you go diving for pearls when you could walk out and pick it up? And that's what the Aborigines did. They were wonderful swimmers, but they never needed to dive for it in those early years. They could just go out and pick up what they wanted at low water spring tides. The industry came under stress for the first time when the Europeans bought bags, Hessian bags. Because rather than carry it in your hands, they then sent them out with bags, and they'd fill the bags and do it, and eventually they started to slowly denude the banks. These are the groups, the group up there, the main group up in that region, Nyaluma, Marthinera and the Jabawara people, coastal people who were harvesting shells in that region, and of course all the way down through Exmouth Gulf and further north. They didn't dive, they just walked out and got it. They waded up to their armpits. Now, Aboriginal people have got extraordinary eyesight, and that same eyesight would have applied underwater. Now, you can check this out when you're having a bath next. Open your eyes and have a look at the plug. You don't need masks and snorkel. You can see the plug, and if your eyes are really good, you can actually pick out detail on the plug. Have a look at it, but if you drown, don't blame me. So this was what they were doing in 1868. They were wading. And as the news went down to Fremantle, people were pouring up there in all sorts of little boats to go pearling, because they realised if you could wade for it, then you could go out to offshore to another bank, which you could see but you couldn't get to, and you'd use these boats if you could, and little rowing boats and stuff, and you'd just fill them up with pearl shell. And if you landed 1 tonne of pearl shells in London, you got £100. A huge amount of money. Then suddenly, in September, we find that the Aborigines are diving. And the women especially are wonderful divers. They're getting down to 42 feet, 7 fathoms, which is over 10 metres. Astonishing. Charles Broadhurst is there. His Aborigines are doing this. His people are pastoral people. He's also becomes resident magistrate, and he learns of a man called Taze, who has collected 9 tonnes of shell, and he knows this man has gone down in the Emma, down to Perth with some of his shell, and with plans to bring more boats and more capital to the industry, and he tells Broadhurst, his resident magistrate, and Taze disappears with a third of the European population of the northwest on board this ship. They disappear completely. Charles and the family decide to leave, though he keeps his flocks there and he keeps people working for him, and his pastoral holding becomes later the Curator station. They come down here and off they go to Melbourne while he tries to raise capital to enter the pearling industry on an even bigger scale. Now what's happened is through the study of this ship, the Xantho, and the study of this man, we've been led into the study of pearling, and we now know how people in the world started diving for pearls. This is a glorious thing out of Jules Verne. It is a man, and they're down in his submarine, and they see a naked diver. Now, naked diving is no mast, no fins, no snorkel. How did they do it? Well, we now know. The mature industries are described by all the explorers. For example, here's the Panama Indians diving for pearls and shell for the Spaniards, but they're using rocks. So you get a great big rock with a rope on it, you jump overboard and you hit the bottom within seconds, and then you burst your eardrums, of course, on the first dive, but then from then on you can keep doing it, which is not very good for you, but you did it, because they were forced to do it. And then you come up with your shell. This is using technology. And the famous Muslim traveller Ibn Battuta records that they were using, in some places, tortoiseshell goggles and stones. So how did they get to this stage? And we now can use the northwest to show how. And the answer lies in this picture here. Have a look at the man or woman in the middle. The foot is on a shell. The other person is being held by the shoulder and has gone down the person's leg to feel for the shell and is picking the shell up. Now, remember I told you about being able to see underwater? After a while, you learn how to recognise the shell. I tried it myself under the Exmouth jetty one day, and I could see things under there, even in really salty water. And if you've got good eyesight, it's even better. And eventually, of course, you learn, well, I can swim. I don't need someone to point it out with their foot. I can dive. And that's exactly how it happened. And we found this transition took place between January 1868 and September 1868. Now there, for those interested, is an Indonesian trochus sheller that I dived with in 1989 on Cartier Island, you know, where all those illegal immigrants are landing. Well, in those days, they used to come there in little sailing ships and used to dive for trochus shell, which is a form of pearl shell. And there's one of them. The only difference between the Aborigines and this man is those little goggles, which are made out of wood with Coke bottles as lenses. Coke bottle bottoms, ground down. So there is how it happened, and we now know through our learnings how that occurred. These are the methods used in those days. I'll let you read it just quickly, but essentially you hopped in a boat, you went right upstream, you then chucked everyone overboard, and then they would come down in the tide, grabbing shells, putting them under their arms and so on, and then come up. The boat is moving almost the same rate as the diver. You drop them in and down you go again. And then when you get to the other end, everyone gets dragged back on board and off you go and start again. Really good if you have a good, nice tide and the vis is not bad, or visibility. And look what was a fair day's work is recovery of 10 or 25 pairs. Now this is described by Streeter in the pearling industry here, and it's identical to what I saw those trochus shell divers doing in 1990. Greed steps in. Now, don't get too worried about the fact that we're Europeans and greedy. Every society is greedy. We've learnt that also, be they Arab, be they whatever. We are all greedy when it comes to wealth and stuff, and we're all prepared to imprison everybody, or were until the last 100 years or so. But this is what happened here. It's terrible. It's the way people were in those days. And if you were black or had any colour in you like me, you were considered to be lesser than. And, you know, that's how it was. Broadhurst is a very clever man, very what would you say, very sort of innovative. And he said, oh, this is interesting. They've got all those convicts down at Rottnest Island, and all the Aborigines up there are dying. So I'll go down to Rotto and ask for some of them to go back pearling. And he got some. He was given some. So he charges off back north with his Aborigines in a ship called the Azure. Half of them disappear. When he came into Champion Bay, they took off. There was a great scandal because Mr. Broadhurst's Aborigines are all over the place. Wherever he went, they jumped ship. And they also failed, and so this is no good. So he decides to go in and introduce the hard hat to pearling. Now, I'm talking about 1868. I'm not talking about 1888 when Broome was all going. This man and his partners introduced the hard hat to pearling 20 years ahead of Broome. Now, the man's a serious innovator. However, he didn't know, and his partners, Dempster, Barker and Gull, didn't know, that there's a lot of learning to go on using the hard hat in tidal conditions. You didn't just plop your diver down. And you can already see the problem here. There's a diver working, and there's a boat under sail moving. So there's a bit of skill involved in learning this. And Broadhurst is very, very despised, and people are suspicious of him. And you can see some of the early letters about bringing Broadhurst into their partnership. I hope Mr. Broadhurst is not being taken into the venture, as I find on inquiry he's not very well thought of. But he seemed to be a nice chap, because when they came from Albany to Perth, he was very pleasant. He fetched wood, lighted fires, harnessed horses. Remembering, of course, you come from Albany to Fremantle by horse or by boat if you had 10 days to waste. They introduced the Hardhat Diving. They come and land in Fremantle. Everyone's very interested, despite the distrust of Broadhurst. And they go to the Flying Foam Passage. Now, this is a passage with 3-knot currents. The shell are just lined along the walls. It's okay if you've got Aboriginal people who drop down, grab it and keep going. But when you put a hardhat diver down, even with his big boots, he's strung out in the breeze, even with his boots like a ribbon. And he was yelling and screaming and carrying on. Those days had no communication. And he refused to go down again. So naturally it was a failure. And you imagine that man being streamed out like a ribbon in the current. You know, it must have been pretty strong current. And there's also a big outlay, and, you know, it wasn't clever. But he was later joined by a man called Alan Hewan, who arrived with his wife. And he had a French arrangement, and we're wondering if it's the forerunner to the scuba tank, which was invented all these years ago. And, you know, we can track Broadhurst and Hewan by the plant specimens that Mrs. Hewan collected and later donated, and the family gave eventually to the herbarium. We've tracked them all through the north, through Mrs. Hewan. It's extraordinary. But they failed. Even though they used Aborigines with the hardhat divers, for some reason Broadhurst kept failing. So he's already done the Denison Plains thing. That's a failure. He's already failed with the Aborigines. He's failed with the hardhat. And we know others were quietly experimenting. So we found this on the wreck of the Emma eventually. We found the Emma a few years ago. So other people were quietly experimenting. But Broadhurst is the acknowledged leader of it all. And he said, oh, this is all a failure. I'm going to introduce steam. I'm going to get steam power. Now, that's the best way to sort these things out. Throw a bit of technology at it. He hadn't learnt the KISS principle. You know the KISS principle? Keep it simple, stupid. He hadn't learnt that. So he goes to the wedding of his sister, who marries the famous Joseph Whitworth, you know, with the Whitworth threads. She was a great philanthropist in her own right. And off he goes to Glasgow, and there he spots this little steamer offered for sale by a scrap metal merchant. Whoa, I'll get one of them and bring it home. Through the Suez Canal he comes. It's just opened. He sees, he gets a register, and he comes here, and he comes all the way down, and the Geraldton press are just ecstatic. They see this thing coming over the horizon, smoke pouring out of it's a steamer. And they race down to the jetty here for Mr. Broadhurst and his little steamer. And when you read the press, it's just extraordinary. Because he'd bought the steamship to the colony, which in those days was seriously struggling. That's Geraldton in that same period, and we've done a xantho in front of the town. He really bases himself, however, at a place called Banangarra, Pardue Station. Those fishing folk amongst you, I recommend that to you, up on Banangarra. And he basically organises himself there, and he brings down Malays. Every time he goes back to Batavia, he brings Malays. Now, Malays are people from the north of Australia. That's what they called everybody, whether you're from the Philippines, from Timor, or wherever, you were called Malay. And they based there, and they went pearling. So he decides, my hardhat's failed, my Aborigines have failed, I'm going to use steam as a mothership, and I'm going to use Malays. There's Banangarra, and the bureaucrats are distraught, because Broadhurst is going direct from Surabaya and Batavia and the Strait settlements down to Banangarra, moving Malays and taking his pearl shell back direct. And he's not going down to Freo to declare what he's doing, so they're not getting any money out of him. And they're so worried because he's become so powerful because he's bought steam. He's just like Gina Reinhardt. She's immensely powerful. Pick up the phone to our great PM and say, look, you know, it's Gina Reinhardt on the phone, and she'll pick up the phone. Well, that's what happened here. You know, and so these extremely powerful people could talk to anybody, and he could with his steamer. And, oh, Mr. Broadhurst, but you're not bringing anything down here. You're not going to Geraldton and declaring. Oh, sorry. He had the Harvey dream of separating the north from the south to open a new colony. Harvey wanted to make himself the leader, this man from down here. Broadhurst, I think, may have had similar ideas, to become the resident magistrate or the leader there. 140 Malays came on this little ship, and by 1873 there were 134 Malays and 291 Aborigines working in the pearling industry. Look at the numbers when you're coming down to 1875. 75 white men, 770 Malays. Just an extraordinary lot of people working in the Norwest pearling industry. Charles comes down to see the family in Fremantle, and he's a very clever man. The ship mainly sailed, and whenever he came close to port, he'd fire up the engine and come in under a cloud of steam, and everybody would think, oh, Mr. Broadhurst's wonderful. Because remember I said there was no coal here, and so on. And he'd come home here, and he came home to the news his little boy, Ernest Edward, had died. And so this is a family photograph taken with one of his Malays at the funerary scene. Eliza is there. She's got a crucifix. The children, this little one's in a christening dress and so on. And there's the children by this time. She's managing this. He keeps failing. And he's then back off up north in the Xantho to hopefully to turn the fortunes around. His Malays were hopeless. Other people's Malays weren't doing quite well, actually. The Aborigines were far better as divers, and they considered the Malays inferior people. And any of you mix with Aboriginal people, they've got glorious humour and tremendous self-esteem, when things are okay. It's not when things are bad, of course, but in their natural environment and in those periods, very strong and had very strong self-worth. So these Malays were hopeless, they reckon. Here he goes up and down the coast. There's Banangarra. There's Nickel Bay. There's Banangarra. So he goes up and down here twice, taking Malays and so on, and frightening people, and also bringing steam to the colony. He also took Aboriginal convicts back from the island, prison at Rottnest, back to Cossack region. So he would take sheep, he would take passengers, he would take anybody. So the government said, Mr. Broadhurst, will you take these people back home? They've served their time. And of course he did that. And we believe that it had such an effect on the Aboriginal people. Well, we know that their pictures of what we believe to be Xantho are now appearing at Aboriginal galleries at Inthanuna Station. 3 steamers appear here, and we think Xantho is the one on the left. We only realised only a week ago, one of the people said to me that figure at the back, which we thought was a man, actually could be a sheep, because we know Broadhurst loaded sheep on Xantho, and to get it out of the hold and lower it across. And you've got a person sitting on the boiler, which we know in the Xantho case, stuck above the deck. So this we think is Xantho. And it's funny, someone told me this only a week ago, and suddenly it makes a lot of sense. I run sheep myself at home, our little place, and that's how a sheep would look if you're hoiking it up through the ribs and out overboard. Quite interesting. However, on his last trip down from the pearling, it's overloaded. It's come down from the pearling. He had it sitting on the beach at a low tide. He was cleaning the weed off the hull, and he scraped through the plates. Said, oh gosh, this is not very good. So he repairs that. He then comes down, but the deck is of pine and it opens up. He comes down to Geraldton out here, and he sees the bark Zephyr waiting for wool and waiting to get ballast in form of rock to fill the hold up, put the wool on top. And somebody says, hey, why don't you go back to Port Gregory, where there's 80 to 100 tonnes of lead ore in bags on the beach from the Geraldine mine. Can you take that, please, and then bring it back down here, and we'll put it in the Zephyr so it can sail nicely with that light wool, and then we can pay money for it. So, of course, he does that. But being a classic entrepreneur, he overloads it, and his captain is going wild. Mr. Broadhurst, please stop, and he refuses to do so. Anyway, they finally stop and leave, and they go out the top and head in the southerly down towards Geraldton, but he's taking water over the bows. And slowly the water's filling up the bows, and they're all up the stern. They don't realise it. They go to bed, and they're roused out of their beds, and they find the ship 7 feet down by the bows, going under. So the captain panics, and Broadhurst takes over, and they race back into Port Gregory, and running in, they hit this sandbar here, and because the ship's 23 years old, the water, when they hit the sandbar, hits the front of the ship and then runs all the way back again through supposedly watertight bulkheads, puts out the fires, and down it sinks. Poor old Broadhurst, he's failed again, and he tries to sell the ship. He abandons his Malays who are wandering around Geraldton destitute. His wife stands up for him in the press and says, you know, my husband's trying to fix us all up, leave him alone. Of course, he's being roundly criticised by everybody because already they think he's a bad man. So he takes off everything he can from the ship and he abandons it, and he decides to abandon the north, to leave the pearl shells of the north and the pearling, and to go to Sharks Bay, where William Dampier had said there was these little shells, and where they found the famous golden pearl, where you can find a shell with 3 or 4 pearls in it. Lots more pearls in the shells of Shark Bay. The shell itself's not very useful, but the pearls are there. They're wonderful things, and there's one of them there. His Malays didn't need to dive. They'd proved a failure. In fact, they started using the dredge, and the Aborigines joined them, and they developed that wonderful special pearling lugger for Shark Bay and did wonderfully well. And in one season, Broadhurst got 200 ounces of pearls, the famous golden pearl, worth thousands and thousands of pounds. And he's eulogised as a man in 10,000 in the press. And when I was studying it, I thought, oh, that's a big call. But then I realised there's only 10,000 men in the colony. It was 20,000, which was interesting. But even still, he was the man. And so he is nominated to Parliament. And Eliza, who'd been struggling with all this, him going broke all the time, suddenly finds herself at the height of her social powers, is suddenly plunged again because her husband's a ratbag, and because he's in debt because he let his Malays go and didn't repatriate them, and they're wandering around Shark Bay destitute. Classic entrepreneur. Terrible. But they were dark, so, you know, who cares? And so she is totally devastated back down here. Not happy, Jan, I think is the thing that you would say there. And you look in here, a most beautiful woman, but with someone who is not, things are not going well. You're dragged out of family in Kilmore, a beautiful British place, a young Irish woman with great talent, with suitors everywhere, and you marry this ratbag. But he wasn't, of course. He's been badly portrayed in that respect. But, you know, things didn't go well for Eliza. If she'd stayed there, she could have remained in beautiful Victoria. Instead, she comes here. So what does she do? She doesn't curl up. She opens a school. There she is. She had worked with her father over east, but look at what her school is offering. English, French, German, Latin, drawing, music, singing. An adult class even down the bottom here for French, German and arithmetic after hours. Now, here's this woman with all these children, husband going broke, getting into all sorts of trouble, causing her all sorts of embarrassment, but she soldiers on. And then in the middle of it all, she has this little boy, her last child. This is Reggie, a glorious picture in my opinion. But so he's a lot older there, but this is, so she's all these things and a mum. He leaves all this and gives it all up and goes down to Mandurah and starts the fish canning industry and is an enormous success. Does brilliantly. And then we find what else Mrs. Broadhurst is about. Her children there are 19, Florence, the eldest boy, not Florence, the famous Florence Broadhurst who's done all the artwork over east. Florence, Charles Jr.'s 18, Sarah's 15, Percy's 13, Katie's 12, Reggie's 4. And we find from all of the diaries that she is running also a drama class, and she's acting here. She's running the Musicians Union, And we also find all the young women are congregating at her house for advice with children and all that sort of thing. And there's a glorious one here, which I will read to you quickly, where the husband says that Bessie and Mrs. Broadhurst had a whist evening, 2 tables, and it was amusing to see the hush and quiet that pervaded the assembly when they heard my latchkey in the lock. They thought it necessary to preserve great gravity, etc., forgetting I had heard screams of laughter and loud disputations a few minutes before. Now, loud disputations is where we're going. Hillman Diaries, wonderful. Sadly, some clown destroyed 2 volumes of them in the family. You know, it's amazing how some people, we can't have that. You know, there's scandal in there, and they've burned the diaries. Anyway, but that's what's remained. He had them, these are only though from that period there. We were given by the family Eliza Broadhurst's scrapbook. And look what she's looking at. Who invented the typewriter? The armless artist Bartram Hillier of Bristol. Top left. His arms were amputated above the elbow, and yet he's doing these beautiful pictures here. A literary curiosity, Oliver Twist and so on. What's this? The imagination of men and women. Now, we're all told in those days that men were supposed to be superior to women, so they got 50, 100 men and women, and they gave them all a drink. And then they told them after they'd had a drink that there was an emetic in it. And far more men threw up than women did. And so this is a report on the imagination of men and women. So women, of course, were not the weaker sex. And they were the stronger sex. It was quite an interesting thing. And she's got it in here. The largest room in the world. And then we find her reading the feminist literature. One of the most conspicuous women in Germany at the present time is Frau Minnecar, the head of suffrage in the Kaiser's dominion, suffrage being getting women the vote. And here she is looking at the question of educating girls. The students of women's colleges were plain and dressed badly. They were rarely beautiful. They were this, they were that, they were the other. Popular prejudice printed the pioneers of the women's education movement as ferocious-looking women with short hair, short skirts, who glared through their spectacles and detested men. And this is the quote that I had for you before. Just have a look at those first 5 lines. So this is in Eliza Broadhurst's scrapbook. The progress of humanity is dependent upon the equality of opportunity being accorded to women the same as it is to men in all departments of life. People think feminism's a modern movement. It's not. She's very keen on the Queen and all that. She's got things in there about why do you have double beds and why do you have the crinoline and why do you do this and why do you do that. And then the gossip, the one here. And Catherine, we can go a little bit over today so I can read this one. That's okay? Okay. What should we do with our girls has been rapidly answered by the girls themselves in America, where the discovery of a new profession is a matter of almost daily occurrence. The unhappy woman who has a problem, all she has to do is ring up a universal sympathiser who, if damaged at the moment, will allow her to pour forth her woes into a consoling bosom at the ridiculously small charge of 3 shillings an hour. The universal sympathiser. In Britain today, we have no need for this for very few women who do not bicycle. That's what it says. Charles leaves Mandurah for the Broadhurst to open a fish canning industry. While there, he sees birds in thousands and he becomes a guano miner. Bird poo, bird fertiliser, head of blood and bone. He's given a monopoly because the government kept going broke with everybody who they allowed to get the guano but would disappear without paying. So they said, right, we'll give Mr. Broadhurst the monopoly to the guano on the Abrolhos Islands. This began the beginnings of monopoly in the mining industry today, because if you can control the monopoly holder, you can make sure you get your royalties. He goes broke again. It doesn't work. What does she do? She opens up another school. Here she is over here. Over on the right, her husband is busy advertising Abrolhos Island guano. And over on the left, she's taking in more schools. She's going to have a boys' school also, a preparatory school. English, Latin and arithmetic, and she'll receive boarders. Now, look at what this woman is doing. It's quite extraordinary. And you can see here that, you know, time has taken its toll. He takes on a silent partner, McNeil, and they become much, much better at it, but still struggling. But they don't really hit their straps until he takes on board his son, who had a mercantile education at Perth Boys. Now, this is classic entrepreneur stuff. The creative person has to have the backup, the accountant, the lawyer, the office staff. You know, you can't run a good show like Catherine here running this great museum without a top support staff. You have a good support staff, it goes well. You have a bad one, it doesn't. And this is what happened here. They exported to the world. They won awards in expositions in Paris. They developed huge, great stone jetties with, if you imagine, a board along top of that with rails on it to run out the guano out on the trolleys out to waiting ships. They established jetties. They brought in huge people, a number of people from all over the islands. There's a great group of Malays here. And at the same time, while he's digging the guano deposits on the Gun Island, he thinks he's found the Batavia. Because the Batavia was wrongly positioned by Stokes and Wickham in 1840 down in the bottom of the islands. And so he develops a collection, makes the first maritime archaeological collection in Australia. He catalogues them and he presents them to the state. He also purchases a copy of Unlucky Voyage, the story of the fabulous Batavia, has it translated at great expense and gives that to the state. Later they realise it's from the Zawick. But his collection is the basis of what the museum has here. They are bought out by, Mum and Dad are bought out by Florence for £10,000, a huge amount of money, and they go off to Bournemouth in England and they call their home Caracatta. 20 years before I joined the museum, I went in there, a little combi, all wet and horrible, and in the shoulder in England, instead of the high seas, and cold as hell. We went in there and had a night in the bed and breakfast, and then drove out and I saw the sign and thought, that's odd, that's a West Australian name. And I was in their house. There they die. She dies at age 59. And I thought, gee, that's young. Gosh. But, you know, people said she was worn out. It's there in the diaries. But she wasn't. 60 was the average age for a woman in 1900. To die, that is. He kept going for quite some years, devastated, I think, by her loss. And he dies a few years later, and they're both buried at Bournemouth. Most importantly is our little girl here who lives with them at Caracatta, comes out, goes and stays in London when after they die and becomes a suffragette. She throws hammers through the post office windows. She does all the things that the suffragettes do. She's imprisoned and force-fed, comes back here and joins the St George Reading Circle of 12 young women. This was seen by an American doctor. She comes over here and says to them, why don't you form a club for women to make women's lives better? And this becomes the Caracatta Club, and this is the club that got women the vote, the third place in the world, Western Australia. And it's no coincidence that her home in England is Caracatta, and this is the Caracatta Club. That's her suffragette badge. And in the meantime, our ship deteriorates. And one of these Malays we've now traced from Shark Bay to Walgo Rock. And we believe now the famous Walgo Rock painting is not a Dutch East Indiaman, as some people believe, but in fact a steamship. Well, we know it's a steamer. It's not a three-masted ship at all. You can see a funnel in the middle. You can also see a mizzen mast aft, where when you bring, say, the Lewin up to anchor for the night, you put your mizzen mast up to keep your nose into the wind. We also see a semi-Cyrillic or Arabic writing here, down the bottom. This has never been deciphered, it's apparently by an illiterate person who's drawn this ship. And we now know, thanks to Stan Gratt, the Midwest historian, that Sammy Malay, or Sammy Hassan, left Shark Bay in 1917 to go to Walgo Rock, And in that year, this painting appears. Is it possible that Sammy's one of Broadhurst's Malays? Who knows? But this is definitely not an East India ship, and we believe it's most likely going to be the Xantho. What we did to check this out is took my underwater work and our reconstructed Xantho and joined the scale together, and there you have it. False gun ports were on ships right through to the 20th century. They're the City of York in 1899, so it is entirely possible. We decided, therefore, to recover the engine. There's Jeff. We cut it free using a thermal lance, 3,000 degrees centigrade. Didn't get much money. At the time, people were only interested in Dutch ships and other things. They were, I was given $7,200 to make that all happen. We came in under budget, but we did have to send a note down to the bureaucrats and say, look, we're struggling with the dog power. Can you send a couple more dogs to tow the boat? That's my team there. We had people from all over Australia join us for this. These people from Canada, from France, from Brunei. Ian McLeod, our head conservator, is coming to do a lecture here soon. Here we are deconcreting it or taking off the concrete-like substance, the seashells and stuff, and getting it ready for display. Dick Garcia here, who had taken apart munitions from the Curator track, said to me that he could take this apart if we let him. And we eventually tried it out and eventually did, and here we are taking it apart. In 2006, we put it back together again in the gallery where people could see it all happening, and we could turn the engine over. Now, that's hard to believe. Now, that's a conservation feat far in advance of, say, the Batavia or anything else you've seen. To take an engine that had been underwater for over 100 years and take it apart and put it back together again is unheard of. And we had people from all over the world join us down there to watch this. And we also had this gentleman build us a working model, Bob Burgess, the late Bob Burgess, from Noel Miller's drawings. And when he produced it and gave it to us, he said, I have to give you a bill. And I said, oh, OK, Bob. And he said, here it is. And it was $49. And he spent 2 years doing it. And that was for all the scrap metal and parts that he gave us. So we finish here. The exhibition down there with the engine, with the story of the Xantho, and with this picture is called Steamships to Suffragettes. And look at the careers of these people. They are serious high achievers. Our boy on the right, a surgeon in London and a violinist. Our girl next, a singer and an actor. Charles, the pastoralist, the pearler, the steamship owner, the guano harvester, the fish canner, the entrepreneur. Since named one of the 100 most influential West Australians of all time, along with Yagan and Dennis Lilly and Fiona Stanley and all that crowd. He's up there. Even though he's controversial. There's our fabulously wealthy guano merchant. There's our Malay diver who we hope managed to get home. A lot of them stayed on and formed that wonderful multicultural group of people that now is at Denham. There's our little suffragette. There's Eliza, the mother, the pianist, the actor, the headmistress, the feminist. There's Percy, who's a station master at Roebourne, and the little one missing, yet to be born, is Reggie, our electrician at Windsor Castle. An amazing family. Thank you.